The banquet hall buzzed with laughter and clinking glasses. But Emily stood frozen at the center of the room, her adoptive family's cruel words slicing through the air like a blade. They mocked her past, her origins, her very existence, their voices loud enough for every guest to hear. Tears stung her eyes as she clutched the edge of her dress, the weight of their betrayal threatening to crush her. Just when she thought she couldn't bear another second, the double doors swung open, and her husband, David, stepped into the room, his face a storm of quiet fury. What happened next would change everything. The chandelier light glittered across the polished wooden floors of the banquet hall, casting a warm glow over the sea of elegantly dressed guests. Emily stood near the edge of the head table, her hands trembling as she adjusted the delicate silver bracelet on her wrist. It was a gift from David, given to her on their first anniversary, a simple band engraved with the words "always enough." She traced the inscription with her thumb, seeking comfort in its familiar weight. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration, a rare gathering of her adoptive family, the Morgans, who had taken her in when she was 6 years old. It was meant to honor her adoptive father's retirement, a milestone that had brought together relatives, colleagues, and friends in a grand display of affection and pride. But for Emily, the evening felt like walking barefoot across broken glass. She had always known her place in the Morgan family was fragile. Adopted from a foster home after years of uncertainty, Emily had grown up under the shadow of their conditional love. Her adoptive mother, Margaret, was a woman of sharp edges and sharper words, always quick to remind Emily how lucky she was to have been saved. Her adoptive siblings, Clara and Thomas, carried their mother's disdain like an inherited trait, their smiles never quite reaching their eyes when they looked at her. Only her adoptive father, Richard, had ever shown her kindness, his quiet nods and gentle encouragement a lifeline in a house that often felt like a stage for her inadequacy. But Richard's warmth couldn't shield her from the rest of the family's resentment, and tonight, that resentment was about to spill over in a way she never could have imagined. The dinner had started pleasantly enough. The scent of roasted lamb and fresh rosemary filled the air, and the hum of conversation was punctuated by the soft clink of wine glasses. Emily sat beside David, her hand resting lightly on his under the table, grateful for his steady presence. He was her anchor, a man whose love had taught her what it meant to be seen, truly seen, for who she was. His dark hair was slightly tousled from the drive, and his warm brown eyes caught hers with a reassuring glance as the speeches began. Richard stood first, his voice steady as he thanked his colleagues and family, his gaze lingering on Emily with a flicker of pride. She smiled back, her heart swelling, believing for a moment that maybe, just maybe, she belonged here. But then Margaret rose to speak. The room quieted, all eyes on the matriarch in her emerald green dress, her silver hair swept into an elegant chignon. She began with a charming anecdote about Richard's early career, her voice smooth and practiced, drawing laughter from the crowd. Emily relaxed slightly, sipping her water, her shoulders easing. But then Margaret's tone shifted, her smile tightening as she turned her gaze toward Emily. "Of course," she said, her voice carrying a saccharine edge. "None of this would have been possible without the sacrifices we've made as a family. Raising children is no small feat, especially when one of them, well, let's just say, comes with a history." The room stilled. Emily's breath caught in her chest, her fingers tightening around David's hand. Margaret continued, her words deliberate, each one landing like a stone. "When we took Emily in, we knew it wouldn't be easy. A child from difficult circumstances with no roots, no real family to speak of. But we did our duty, didn't we? We gave her a chance, even if she's never quite fit the mold." A few guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting toward Emily. Clara, sitting across the table, smirked, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against her glass. Thomas leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable but his silence deafening. Emily's face burned, the heat creeping up her neck as she stared at the tablecloth, willing herself to disappear. The words weren't new. She'd heard versions of them her whole life, but to have them spoken here, in front of strangers, friends, and her husband, was a violation she hadn't prepared for. Her mind flashed back to her childhood, to the nights she'd spent curled up in her small bedroom, listening to Margaret's hushed arguments with Richard about that girl, and what we've had to give up. She had worked so hard to prove herself, to be more than the orphan they'd grudgingly taken in. She'd earned a degree, built a career, married a man who loved her fiercely. And yet, here she was, reduced to a charity case in a room full of people who now saw her as less. David's hand tightened around hers, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. She could feel the tension in him, the way his jaw clenched as he stared at Margaret, who was now basking in the polite applause of those who didn't know better. Emily wanted to stand, to run, to scream, but her legs felt like lead, her voice trapped in her throat. The room seemed to close in, the laughter and chatter resuming but sounding distant, like a radio playing in another room. She was 6 years old again, standing in the doorway of the Morgans' pristine living room, clutching a tattered stuffed bear, knowing she didn't belong. Then Clara stood, her wine glass raised, her voice bright and cutting. "To Mom and Dad," she said, her eyes locking onto Emily with a cruel glint, "for their generosity, their patience, and for always doing what's best for the family, even when it's hard." The words were a dagger, twisted with just enough sweetness to pass as a toast. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, but Emily could feel the weight of every glance, every whisper. She was the outsider, the burden, the one who didn't belong. Her heart pounded, her vision blurring with unshed tears. She wanted to disappear, to erase herself from this moment, this family, this life. But then, a sound cut through the haze, the sharp creak of the banquet hall doors swinging open. Heads turned, conversations faltered, and Emily looked up, her breath hitching. There, in the doorway, stood David. He had slipped away earlier unnoticed to take a call, but now he was back, his broad shoulders filling the frame, his face a mask of controlled fury. The room seemed to hold its breath as he stepped forward, his footsteps deliberate, echoing against the polished floor. Emily's heart stuttered, a flicker of hope battling the shame that had nearly consumed her. He wasn't just her husband. He was her shield, her defender, the one person who had always seen her worth. And as he moved toward the head table, his eyes locked on Margaret, Emily knew that whatever happened next would shift the ground beneath them all. The air in the banquet hall thickened as David crossed the room, his presence pulling every eye like a magnet. Emily's heart thudded in her chest, a mix of dread and relief swirling within her. His dark suit was slightly rumpled from the evening's chaos, but his posture was unyielding, his gaze fixed on Margaret, who stood frozen at the head table, her wine glass still raised in a toast now forgotten. The soft clatter of silverware and the murmur of curious whispers faded into a tense hush. Emily's fingers gripped the edge of her chair, the cool wood grounding her as she watched her husband move with a purpose she hadn't seen since the day he'd confronted a colleague who'd wronged her years ago. That day, he'd been her quiet protector. Tonight, she sensed something fiercer brewing beneath his calm exterior. David stopped a few feet from the head table, his eyes sweeping over the Morgans. Margaret's rigid smile, Clara's arched brow, Thomas's feigned indifference. He didn't raise his voice, but when he spoke, his words carried the weight of a man who had run out of patience. "I've heard enough," he said. his tone low but sharp enough to cut through the room's lingering chatter. Emily is my wife. She's my family. And I won't stand here while you tear her down to make yourselves feel bigger. The guests shifted in their seats, some leaning forward, others glancing at Emily, whose face burned with a mix of gratitude and fear. She wanted to reach for him, to pull him back, but her body felt anchored to the spot, her breath shallow. Margaret's lips parted, her composure faltering for a split second before she recovered, her smile tightening into something almost predatory. "David," she said, her voice dripping with forced warmth, "this is a family matter. You're taking it out of context." She tilted her head, as if addressing a child who'd misunderstood a simple lesson. Clara nodded in agreement, her eyes glinting with amusement, while Thomas folded his arms, watching the scene unfold like a spectator at a play. But David didn't waver. He took another step forward, his hands loose at his sides but his shoulders squared, a man ready to defend what mattered most. "Family?" David repeated, his voice steady but laced with an edge that made Emily's stomach twist. "Family doesn't stand up in front of a room full of people and humiliate one of their own. Family doesn't treat someone like a burden for existing. You don't get to claim that word when you've spent years making Emily feel like she's less than you." His words hung in the air, raw and unyielding, and Emily felt a tear slip down her cheek, hot against her skin. She brushed it away quickly, her heart aching with the truth of what he said. She had spent so long trying to earn the Morgans' love, to prove she was worthy of the scraps they offered, that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be defended so fiercely. The room was a tapestry of reactions. Some guests looked away, uncomfortable, while others whispered to their neighbors, their eyes darting between David and Margaret. Richard, seated at the far end of the table, rubbed his temple, his face heavy with something that looked like regret. Emily wanted to believe he'd speak up, that the man who'd once read her bedtime stories would stand for her now, but he remained silent, his gaze fixed on the table. Margaret, however, was undeterred. She set her glass down with a deliberate clink, her smile never wavering. "You're being dramatic, David," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "We've given Emily everything. A home, an education, opportunities she never would have had. If she feels slighted, perhaps she should reflect on her gratitude." The word gratitude hit Emily like a slap, echoing the countless times Margaret had wielded it as a weapon. Gratitude for the clothes that never quite fit, for the backhanded compliments, for the constant reminder that she was a guest in their world, never truly one of them. Her chest tightened, memories flooding back. The nights she'd cried herself to sleep, the days she'd tiptoed through the Morgan house, afraid to take up too much space. She wanted to stand, to say something, anything, but her voice felt locked away, buried under years of trying to be small, to be good, to be enough. David's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening as he looked at Margaret. "Gratitude?" he said, his voice quieter now but no less forceful. "You think Emily owes you for treating her like an outsider in her own home? For making her feel like she has to earn your love?" He turned to the guests, his gaze sweeping the room, unflinching. "Emily is the strongest person I know. She's built a life despite every obstacle you've put in her way. She's kind, brilliant, and more resilient than any of you could ever hope to be. And you?" He turned back to Margaret, his voice steady but searing. "You don't deserve her." A gasp rippled through the crowd, soft but audible. Emily's breath caught, her heart pounding as she looked at David, his words sinking into her like sunlight breaking through a storm. For so long, she'd carried the weight of the Morgans' judgment, their subtle and not so subtle ways of telling her she wasn't enough. But here was David, standing in the center of their world, tearing down the walls they'd built around her. She felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years, pride. Not just in him, but in herself. She straightened in her chair, her hands steadying, the bracelet on her wrist catching the light as if to remind her of his words. Always enough. Clara laughed. A sharp, brittle sound that cut through the tension. "Oh, please," she said, tossing her hair. "This is all very noble, David, but let's not pretend Emily's some saint. She's always been difficult, ungrateful. You're just too blinded by love to see it." Her words were meant to wound, and they did, each one a needle pricking at the fragile confidence Emily had begun to feel. But before she could sink back into that familiar shame, David turned to Clara, his expression unreadable but his voice calm, almost dangerously so. "Difficult?" he said, stepping closer to the table. "You mean she dared to exist? To have her own thoughts, her own dreams, despite your family's best efforts to make her feel like nothing? That's not difficulty, Clara. That's strength." He paused, letting the words settle, then looked at Emily, his eyes softening for the first time since he'd entered the room. "And I see it every day." Emily's throat tightened, her vision blurring as she met his gaze. In that moment, the room seemed to fade. The guests, the Morgans, the glittering chandelier, all of it dissolved until it was just her and David, his love a lifeline pulling her from the depths of her doubt. She wanted to stand, to walk to him, to tell him how much his words meant. But before she could move, Margaret spoke again, her voice colder now, stripped of its earlier pretense. "This is my husband's night," she said, her eyes narrowing. "If you can't respect that, David, perhaps you and Emily should leave." The words were a challenge, a line drawn in the sand. Emily's heart sank, the weight of being cast out once again pressing down on her. But David didn't flinch. He looked at Margaret, then at Emily, and something in his expression shifted. A decision made, a resolve hardened. He extended his hand to her, his voice soft but firm. "Emily," he said, "let's go." And as she rose, her legs unsteady but her heart steadier than it had been all night, she knew that whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. Emily's hand slipped into David's, his palm warm and steady against her trembling fingers. The banquet hall, with its glittering lights and sea of staring faces, seemed to blur as she stood, her legs shaky but her resolve bolstered by the quiet strength in his grip. The weight of Margaret's words, "Perhaps you and Emily should leave," hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and ominous. Emily felt the eyes of the guests boring into her, a mix of pity, curiosity, and judgment that made her skin prickle. She wanted to shrink, to disappear into the polished floor, but David's presence anchored her, his hand a silent promise that she didn't have to face this alone. As they turned toward the double doors, the soft rustle of her dress and the echo of their footsteps were the only sounds in the suddenly silent room. Margaret's voice cut through the stillness, sharp and commanding. "Emily, think carefully before you walk out. This is your family's night. Leaving now is a choice you'll have to live with." The words were laced with a familiar venom, the kind that had always made Emily second-guess herself, question whether she was the problem. For a moment, she hesitated, her heart twisting with the old, ingrained fear of disappointing the Morgans, of proving them right about her ingratitude. She glanced back at the head table, where Margaret stood tall, her emerald dress catching the light, her expression a mask of controlled indignation. Clara leaned forward, her smirk barely concealed, while Thomas watched with detached curiosity, as if this were just another chapter in a story he'd long stopped caring about. But then Emily's eyes found Richard, her adoptive father, still seated at the far end of the table. His hands were folded in his lap, his shoulders slumped, his face etched with a quiet sorrow that made her chest ache. She remembered the man who'd once knelt beside her to tie her shoelaces, who'd slipped her extra cookies when Margaret wasn't looking, who'd told her she was smart enough to do anything. That man seemed so far away now, buried under years of silence and compromise. He met her gaze for a fleeting moment, his eyes glistening with something unspoken, regret, perhaps, or an apology he couldn't voice. But he didn't stand, didn't speak, and that silence cut deeper than Margaret's words ever could. David squeezed her hand gently, pulling her attention back to him. His brown eyes were steady, unwavering, a lighthouse in the storm of her emotions. "You don't owe them anything," he said softly, his voice just for her, cutting through the noise of her doubts. "Not your time, not your pain, not your presence." His words were a lifeline, and Emily clung to them, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. She nodded, a small but resolute gesture, and took a step toward the doors, her hands still clasped in his. As they moved, the crowd parted slightly, a ripple of whispers following them. Emily caught fragments of their words: ungrateful, dramatic, poor Richard, and each one stung, but they couldn't pierce the shield of David's support. She focused on the rhythm of their steps, the way his thumb brushed against her knuckles, the faint scent of his cologne grounding her. The doors loomed closer, their polished wood promising escape, but also uncertainty. Leaving meant drawing a line, choosing herself over the family that had never fully chosen her. It was a choice that felt both liberating and terrifying, like stepping off a cliff with no guarantee of solid ground below. Just as they reached the threshold, Clara's voice rang out, sharp and mocking. "Running away, Emily? That's so like you. Always the victim, never the one to stay and face the truth." The words were a barbed arrow, aimed to wound, and they found their mark. Emily's steps faltered, her breath hitching as the old wounds reopened. The years of being told she was too sensitive, too difficult, too much. She felt the urge to turn, to defend herself, to prove she wasn't what they said. But before she could, David stopped, his hand tightening around hers as he turned to face Clara. "Enough," he said, his voice low but carrying a weight that silenced the room. "You don't get to rewrite her story to fit your narrative. Emily's not running, she's choosing. Choosing to walk away from people who've spent years trying to make her feel small. And if you can't see the courage in that, then you're the ones who need to face the truth." His words were a thunderclap, reverberating through the hall, and Emily felt a swell of pride mixed with awe. David wasn't just defending her. He was rewriting the script she'd been trapped in, giving her permission to be more than the Morgan's charity case. Clara's face flushed, her mouth opening as if to retort, but no words came. Margaret stepped forward, her expression icy. "This is a private matter," she said, her voice clipped. "You're making a spectacle, David. If you insist on leaving, do it quietly." The dismissal was clear, a final attempt to control the narrative, to keep the facade of the Morgan family intact. But David didn't respond. He turned back to Emily, his eyes softening, and nodded toward the doors. "Let's go," he said again, his voice gentle but firm, a reminder that this was her choice, her moment. Emily took a deep breath, the air cool against her flushed cheeks. She looked at David, at the man who had seen her at her most broken and loved her anyway, who had stood up to a room full of people to remind her of her worth. She thought of the little girl she'd been, clutching that tattered stuffed bear, desperate for a family to claim her. That girl had spent so long trying to fit into the Morgans' world, bending herself to their expectations, swallowing her pain to keep the peace. But she wasn't that girl anymore. She was Emily, David's wife, a woman who had built a life despite the odds, who had found love that didn't come with conditions. As they stepped through the doors, the cool night air hit her face, sharp and cleansing. The sounds of the banquet hall faded behind them, replaced by the distant hum of traffic and the rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. Emily's heart was still racing, her emotions a tangle of grief and relief, but for the first time that night, she felt like she could breathe. David didn't let go of her hand as they walked toward their car, parked under the glow of a street lamp. The world felt quieter out here, the stars above a silent witness to the shift happening within her. She stopped, turning to face him, her eyes searching his. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "for seeing me, for all of it." David's expression softened, a small smile tugging at his lips as he brushed a strand of hair from her face. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "You're worth it. You've always been worth it." And in that moment, under the soft glow of the street lamp, Emily felt something new, a spark of belief in herself, fragile but growing, like a seed finally breaking through the soil. The night air wrapped around Emily like a soft blanket as she and David stood beside their car, the street lamp casting a golden halo over them. Her heart still raced from the confrontation in the banquet hall, but the weight of the Morgans' words felt lighter now, diluted by the open sky and David's unwavering presence. She clutched the silver bracelet on her wrist, its inscription, asterisk always enough asterisk, a quiet mantra grounding her in this moment. The city hummed softly in the distance, car horns and faint music blending into a rhythm that felt alive, like the pulse of a new beginning. Emily looked at David's face, his eyes reflecting the streetlight, and felt a surge of gratitude so deep it nearly overwhelmed her. He hadn't just stood up for her. He'd given her the courage to stand for herself, to walk away from a family that had never truly been hers. They slid into the car, the leather seats cool against her skin. David started the engine, but he didn't drive right away. Instead, he turned to her, his hand resting lightly on the gearshift, his expression gentle but searching. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft, carrying the weight of everything they just left behind. Emily nodded, though her throat tightened, words struggling to form. She wasn't okay. Not yet. But she was better than she'd been an hour ago, when Margaret's voice had stripped her bare in front of a room full of strangers. She reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his, and managed a small smile. "I will be," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "Because of you." David shook his head, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "Not because of me," he said. "Because of you. You're the one who walked out of there, Emily. You chose yourself tonight." His words settled into her, warm and solid, like stones in a riverbed. She wanted to believe him, to fully embrace the idea that she was enough, that she didn't need the Morgans' approval to define her worth. But the years of doubt, the echoes of Margaret's sharp tongue and Clara's cruel smirks, still lingered like shadows at the edges of her mind. She leaned back in her seat, staring out the windshield at the quiet street, the world beyond the banquet hall stretching out with possibilities she'd never dared to imagine. As David pulled the car onto the road, the city lights blurred past, streaks of gold and red against the dark. Emily's thoughts drifted back to her childhood, to the moments she'd clung to as proof of her place in the Morgan family. There was the time Richard had taken her to the library, letting her check out as many books as she could carry, his laughter warm as she staggered under the weight of her choices. Or the Christmas when he'd slipped a small, hand-carved wooden bird into her stocking, a secret gift that felt like a promise of belonging. But those moments were always overshadowed by Margaret's cold corrections, Clara's taunts, Thomas's indifference. Emily had spent so long trying to stitch those fleeting kindnesses into a tapestry of family, but tonight, that tapestry had unraveled, leaving her to face the truth. The Morgans had never been her home. The car slowed as they approached a red light, and Emily glanced at David, his profile steady against the glow of the dashboard. She thought of their life together, the small apartment they'd made their own, filled with mismatched furniture and shelves of her favorite books. The quiet mornings when they'd sit on the balcony with coffee, his hand resting on her knee as they watched the sunrise. David had given her a family, not in name but in truth, in the way he listened to her fears, celebrated her triumphs, and loved her without conditions. The realization hit her like a wave, both painful and freeing. She didn't need the Morgans to define her. She had built something better, something real, with the man sitting beside her. "Do you think I was wrong to leave?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. The question had been simmering in her chest, a remnant of the guilt Margaret had always known how to wield. David glanced at her, his eyes soft but resolute. "No," he said firmly. "You weren't wrong. Staying would have meant letting them keep hurting you, and you deserve better than that. You always have." He paused, his hand tightening around hers. "But it's okay to feel torn. They were part of your life for better or worse. It's okay to grieve what you hoped they'd be." His words unlocked something in Emily, a flood of emotions she hadn't let herself feel. She thought of Richard's silence, the way he'd looked at her as she left, his eyes heavy with unspoken words. She wanted to hate him for not standing up for her, for letting Margaret and Clara tear her down, but she couldn't. He was the closest thing she'd had to a father, and his absence tonight hurt more than Margaret's cruelty. A tear slipped down her cheek, and she didn't wipe it away this time. David reached over, his hand brushing her face gently, catching the tear with his thumb. "You're allowed to feel all of it," he said, "but don't let it make you doubt who you are." The light turned green, and the car moved forward, the city unfolding around them. Emily's mind wandered to the future, to what lay beyond this night. She imagined a life where she no longer carried the weight of the Morgans' judgment, where she could step into rooms without bracing for rejection. It felt distant, like a dream she could see but not yet touch, but for the first time it felt possible. She thought of her work, the community center where she taught art classes to kids from tough backgrounds, kids who reminded her of the girl she'd been. She poured her heart into those classes, giving them the encouragement she'd craved, and maybe, she realized, that was her way of rewriting her story, not just for herself, but for them. As they drove, the radio played softly, a familiar song about love and second chances filling the quiet. Emily leaned her head against the window, the glass cool against her skin, and let the music wash over her. She thought of the banquet hall, of the faces she'd left behind, and felt a pang of sadness for the family she'd once hoped for. But that sadness was tempered by something new, a spark of defiance, a refusal to let their words define her any longer. She glanced at David, his hands steady on the wheel, and felt a warmth spread through her chest. This was her family, her home, her truth. The car turned onto their street, their apartment building coming into view, its familiar brick facade a quiet comfort. Emily knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The wounds from tonight would linger, and the Morgans' voices would echo in her quieter moments. But she also knew she wasn't alone. With David by her side, and with the strength she was beginning to claim as her own, she could face whatever came next. As they pulled into the parking lot, the stars above seemed brighter, their light a promise of something new, something hers. The apartment door clicked shut behind Emily and David, the sound soft but final, like the closing of a chapter. The familiar scent of their home, freshly brewed coffee, the faint sweetness of lavender from a candle on the counter, wrapped around her, easing the tension that still clung to her shoulders. The living room was dimly lit, the glow of a single lamp casting warm shadows across the walls. where framed photos and small mementos told the story of their life together. Emily slipped off her shoes, her feet sinking into the worn rug, and felt the weight of the evening begin to loosen its grip. This was her sanctuary, a place where she wasn't an outsider, where every corner held a memory of love and laughter. David set his keys on the counter, his movements quiet, giving her space to breathe, to process, to find her footing. She walked to the couch and sank into its familiar cushions, pulling her knees to her chest. The banquet hall felt like a lifetime ago, but the sting of Margaret's words, Clara's smirk, and Richard's silence still lingered, sharp against the edges of her heart. Emily traced the silver bracelet on her wrist, its inscription a quiet anchor, always enough. She wanted to believe it, to let those words drown out the voices that had spent years telling her she was less. David joined her, sitting close but not crowding, his presence a steady warmth. He didn't push her to speak, but his hand found hers, his fingers lacing through hers with a gentleness that made her eyes burn with unshed tears. "I keep thinking about Richard," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "The way he looked at me when we left, like he wanted to say something, but couldn't." She swallowed, the ache in her chest sharpening. "He was the only one who ever made me feel like I belonged, even a little. And tonight, he just sat there." The betrayal cut deeper than she'd expected, not because it was new, but because it was final. Richard had been her tether to the Morgans, the one who'd given her glimpses of what a father's love could be. But his silence had severed that thread, leaving her adrift in a way she hadn't anticipated. David's thumb brushed over her hand, his touch grounding her. "He's human, Emily," he said softly. "He's caught between you and them, and he made a choice tonight, even if it was by not choosing. That's not your fault. It's his." His words were gentle but firm, a reminder that she didn't have to carry the weight of Richard's inaction. Emily nodded, her throat tight, and leaned her head against his shoulder. The warmth of his presence, the steady rhythm of his breathing, was a balm to the raw edges of her heart. She thought of the little girl she'd been, desperate for approval, and realized that girl was still inside her, but she was learning to let go, to make room for the woman she was becoming. The quiet of the apartment settled around them, broken only by the soft hum of the city outside. Emily's gaze drifted to a photo on the coffee table, a candid shot from their wedding day, her laughing as David spun her on the dance floor, her white dress fanning out like wings. That day, she'd felt weightless, unburdened by the Morgans' expectations, free to be herself in a way she'd never thought possible. She wanted to reclaim that feeling, to build a life where she didn't have to prove her worth to anyone. "I don't want to go back," she said suddenly, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "To them, to that house, to any of it. I'm done." David turned to her, his eyes searching hers, a flicker of pride in his expression. "Then don't," he said simply. "You don't have to. You get to decide what family means now, Emily. You get to choose who's in your corner." His words were a spark, igniting something fierce and fragile within her. She thought of the kids at the community center, their eager faces as they painted, their stories so much like her own. She thought of the friends who'd become her chosen family, the ones who celebrated her without conditions. And she thought of David, who'd stood in a room full of people and fought for her, not because he had to, but because he believed in her. Emily straightened, her shoulders lifting as if shedding an invisible weight. "I want to keep teaching at the center," she said, her voice growing steadier. "Those kids, they need someone who sees them, who tells them they're enough. I want to be that for them, the way you are for me." David's smile was soft, his eyes bright with something that looked like awe. "You already are," he said. "You've always been that for them." And for me. He leaned in, pressing a kiss to her forehead, and Emily felt a warmth spread through her, a quiet strength taking root. She stood, drawn to the balcony door, and stepped outside, the night air cool against her skin. The city stretched out before her, a tapestry of lights and lives, each one a story unfolding. Emily leaned against the railing, David joining her, his arm brushing hers. She thought of the banquet hall, of the Morgans' cold words, and realized they no longer held the power they once did. They were a chapter in her story, but not the whole book. She was writing the rest now, page by page, with every choice she made to love herself, to build a life that felt true. As the stars glittered above, Emily took a deep breath, the air filling her lungs with possibility. She wasn't the girl who'd stood in the Morgans' doorway, clutching a tattered bear, hoping for love. She was Emily, a woman who'd faced her pain and walked away, who'd found a home in the heart of the man beside her and in the life she was building. The road ahead would have its shadows, but she was ready to face them, not as an outsider, but as someone who knew her worth. With David's hand in hers and the night sky stretching wide, Emily felt, for the first time, that she was truly, undeniably enough.